we need the next speaker since, thank you very much. Since Jim Bay's in here, Joe Heath, an attorney, and he's going to present some things today.
Well, thank you all for coming. The wells that are going on here with 80,000 gallons that they're fracked are very, very small compared to what is happening in the Marcellus drilling in Pennsylvania. They're using 2 to 8 million gallons of water per frack. So you can see the size difference just there. This is a well within the last year. All the slides here are within the last year from Pennsylvania. And the main thing that I want to start out with here is that this is a very, very industrial process. It's not your grandfather's gas well. I live over in Cortland County. My brother-in-law asked me about 6 or 7 years ago, should he sign a gas lease? None of us knew about fracking 6 or 7 years ago. The companies did because they were doing it out in Colorado, but when they came around to get your leases, if any of you have leases, they didn't tell you what fracking was or some of the problems that came up with it. This is a frac pad. I don't know how well you can see this, but it dwarfs this dairy farm. Now this is the drilling process. I've got some other slides here. Most of us know this now, so I'll try to get to them quickly. So what they're able to do now is drill down vertically, then turn the drill bit horizontally. They can go up to 1 mile horizontally. They'll have many wells per pad and go out in many different directions. When they get horizontal, then they put holes in the horizontal pipe, and then they use high pressure water, sand, and chemicals to break up the shale. We've got all the easy shale. It used to be all the wells over in the western part of the state, Allegheny, Cattaraugus County. That was where we just drilled vertically down into a pocket of gas, and it's basically like drinking a soda. You just have the gas come up. We got all that easy stuff. Now we've got microscopic pockets of gas in these various shale formations that were formed 350 million years ago. In order to get that gas, the high volume slick water horizontal fracking breaks up the shale. Supposedly that gas will come back up the pipe, and that's the whole process if it goes well. It doesn't always go well. And that's what some of you already know and what you're concerned about. So this is just the diagrams that show that. This is a drill, a pad being drilled. So there's many different types of polluted materials that come out of these wells. One is during the drilling process, drilling mud. They use a petroleum distillate, somewhat like diesel oil, although the EPA won't let them use diesel oil, but it's a petroleum distillate and other things. That has to be disposed of. This is during the drilling operation. Now, I looked on your website, and it's a very nice description of the town. And I should say I've lived in upstate New York for most of my 66 years. I grew up in Oswego County. My father taught agriculture there until it was phased out in the 60s. I worked on dairy farms growing up. I lived in Syracuse quite a few years, and now I live down in Cortland County. So I'm pretty familiar with rural New York. And McDonough's website says you should be inspired by our charming countryside and natural surroundings and enjoying beautiful views and remaining scenic oases, preserving our natural beauty. That's very good. And that's why most of us live out in rural New York, where we do. But people in Pennsylvania have come to learn that that does not go with fracking. That's not a beautiful view. These are the compressors. These are highly industrial operations, 24/7. You have huge diesel engines running to drill, to compress, to pump. You have compressor stations. We'll have a picture of that in a minute. This is a picture that was on the front cover of Scientific American. And the industry likes to call this frack water. That's not the kind of water most of us want around our wells or our livestock. This is a compressor station in Pennsylvania. These are old slides. We need to understand that the supplemental generic environmental impact statement does not contain any regulations. It's basically a wish list. There's a separate set of regulations, and hopefully those are getting better. We've had 2 versions of the environmental impact statement, and the second one is better. And it does call for the containment of the frac fluid that comes out of a well in steel casings. That's certainly better than what you're going to see here. We need to understand why we're at ground zero here. And that's what upstate New York is. And that is because these are the various shale formations around the country. This is the combined Marcellus and Utica. You don't hear much about the Utica. One of the things I try to do is help people understand that it's not just the Marcellus that the companies are at. But the combined Utica and Marcellus, you can see why there's more attention being paid here than around the country. This is the map taken out of the state skies. This is how far below the surface the Marcellus is. And if it's less than 2,000 feet below the surface, they're not going to let them frack. And that's the 2,000-foot mark here. We had a driller come to the Cortland, I live in Cortland County, there's a volunteer group there, meets once a month. We had a driller come there a couple of years ago and say, you don't have to worry about them drilling in Cortland County because the Marcellus is too shallow. Well, that's like a lot of things we hear from the industry, there's another side to the story. And that's because there's a Utica shale several thousand feet below the Marcellus that's more than deep enough. That's the 2,000-foot mark for the Utica shale. So all of this territory is subject to drilling into the Utica shale. These are parallel with the surface, several thousand feet down. That's why they go horizontally, so they get maximum exposure when they're trying to extract the gas like we said before. This is Cortland County. That's the leasing. This came from our county planning department. 48% of the area is leased by 8% of the people. The landowners, probably less than 5% of the people have leased half our county. And one of the reasons that I go out, somebody asked me before, why do you do this on weekends? I don't get paid by the industry. I don't get paid to do this. I'm very worried about my own well. Most of us who live in the country have our own wells. And once you all know, if your well is ruined, and many people's wells have been ruined in New York, go to the Cattaraugus County Health Department's website. The reason the DEC doesn't know about wells being ruined is they don't keep the statistics. The county health departments do. Go to the Cattaraugus and county health department. There have been many, many polluted wells from vertical drilling, much smaller scale. And in Cortland County, we have what's called the sole source aquifer. This is the county, the same area as you saw here. And anybody who lives in this yellow area, we only have one source of water. Very shallow, about 20 to 30 feet wells. That's a glacial aquifer. One mistake in that, we don't have wells. So the position that I take is pretty different than what we hear, what we just heard. It's not safe, it's not green or bridge fuel, it's not properly regulated, it's not democratic, it takes away the rights of landowners, it's not about energy independence, it's about corporate profit. And really what we need to do is we need to stop switching from one fossil fuel to another and think about our children and grandchildren and come up with a sustainable energy solution rather than moving from coal to gas. We probably can't get through all of that today. Here's a couple of examples of how we know it's not safe. We don't have to take my word for it. This is a company statement filed with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is what the companies say to their shareholders. This isn't anything that I say. Oil and gas operations are subject to many risks, including well blowouts, explosions, fires, pipeline rupture, pollution, and other environmental risks. And it goes on. Severe damage to property, cleanup responsibilities. And as we begin drilling into deeper horizons and more geologically complex areas, we could experience a greater increase in operation and financial risk. So it's very much like the deep water. As we get further and further out into more complex engineering, in order to get these more difficult to extract gas and oil reserves, we have more of a risk. And what we've seen is that as the risk increases, you have problems. So you have the companies telling their investors that it's risky. This is a letter from May of 2010 from 150 scientific society presidents representing over 1.5 million scientists. And they caution that some energy systems are promoted to help climate change, but they haven't received adequate scrutiny, and they may actually aggravate global warming and pollute the environment to a greater extent than greatly appreciated. This is 150 scientific society presidents saying. More quotes from that letter. Then we have the USGS comments. This is the experts in geology, federal government experts in geology. Very conservative bunch, in my opinion. I should explain that I've been a lawyer since 1975. I do a lot of environmental work, mainly around the Clean Water Act, trying to clean up Onondaga Lake, which is the most polluted lake in the country, from other industrial pollution. There's other problems around Onondaga Creek caused by underground salt mining that was done according to DEC regulations that have severely limited and polluted and ruined Onondaga Creek. So that's my background. USGS we work with on a number of things. They are very critical that the buffers are not large enough, but mostly they say that the DEC does not understand the complexity of the geology underground. Here's the map that the state works from that talks about underground faults. Doesn't look like much problem down here. Here's the USGS map. This is a page from the New York City's comment about the first S-guys 2 years ago. And what it shows is that there are naturally occurring faults throughout the state that we don't know about. There's also 40,000 abandoned gas wells that they have no clue where they are. Because it was before regulation, 40,000 holes down into the ground that can be conduits for chemicals and methane to transfer back up. And that's what this shows here. No matter how well you do this boring and cementing, we'll come back to cementing in a minute, and you come across horizontally, you can very well find a natural fault. This is a picture of a man taken from the Syracuse newspaper. This is a highly explosive material. It's dangerous. And in Pennsylvania, this is a retired school teacher saying that they live in a dead zone. If you want to see what's really going on, take a trip down to Bradford, Pennsylvania. This is how people have to live now next to fracking.
What's that pipe? Vent.
That pipe is a vent. A vent. Because if you don't vent your wells that have been polluted by methane, you have a danger of it accumulating to such a point that it will explode. And so, you'll see more of these in just a minute. And behind this woman is what's called the water buffalo. Because if your well's bad, you have to have another way to hold your clean water. And one of the things that we read about in Pennsylvania is when you have water buffaloes outside, you then have to spend an awful lot of money during the summer, during the winter to keep them from freezing. $500–600 a month to keep them from freezing. There's another vent. That's a water buffalo. This is how people have to live after fracking goes bad. This is a stream in Pennsylvania that's polluted with petroleum. This is what goes wrong on well pads when they're not well regulated. It flows over the edge, kills trees, migrates down to wetland. This is the Allegheny National Forest, broken up now by roads, pipelines, Allegheny National Forest.
National Forest?
That's it.
National Forest.
Good thing New York State doesn't allow that. interstate laws.
I'm hard of hearing.
Good thing New York State doesn't allow that in interstate lanes.
Yeah.
Say again?
You heard me the second time.
No, he said,
When I get to the questions, we'll have to speak up. Okay? We'll come back to whatever you want to bring up. Now, we're told that the protection as we go through the aquifers is from the cement. That's nice, it works. Here's one of the major industry leaders, Schlumberger, is one of the major service companies that provide services to the oil and gas industry. This is from their website. And what it says is that a high percentage of wells in the US and Canada and other locations around the world show gas leakage as they age. The cement fades. And one of the reasons is, as we heard, the idea here is you drill down 1,000 feet or 1,000 feet, you pull the bit out, you put a pipe down, then you want the cement to go down the middle and come back up the sides. Now, how many of you have worked with cement? You know that when you pour cement, you got to have vibrators. When I worked construction in the 60s, when you could get a union job pretty easily, we couldn't pour cement on the interstates unless we had a state inspector standing there supervising. No inspectors are there when this is going on. And so the idea is that the cement will come back up and fill every gap in that 1,000 feet. Then you subject that to pressure, and that's high pressure. There's a close-up of that. Susquehanna River was just declared one of the most endangered river in the United States because of the drilling and the fracking that is in the Marcellus Shale. So that's water pollution, and we hear quite a lot about that. One of the things that we don't hear much about is air pollution. This is the EPA within the last month. This is April, I can't see, 18, New York Times. They capped emissions for drilling for fuel. Now this, they put it off 3 years. But those red circles, those are mine. Here's what it says. This is the first rule to deal with serious air pollution. This is the EPA, associated with fracking, because it releases toxic and cancer-causing chemicals like benzene, hexene. Those are carcinogenic chemicals that go in the air around these operations, as well as methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. We'll come back to what that does for climate change, causing health problems and widespread air pollution. This is the EPA. Now, we've heard that what the industry wants to tell us is, well, we'd be much better off as we move from burning coal to gas if we produce electricity. And we do know that when you burn gas, it's cleaner than coal at the moment of ignition. But two scientists at Cornell, in the only peer-reviewed study a year ago, have proven is that because of the leaking of methane during the drilling, during the compressing, during the transportation, methane is a worse gas for climate change. 105 times worse for climate change over a 20-year window. If we don't deal with climate change in the next 20 years, we've already lost. We may have already lost now, according to most scientists. So, Professor Howarth and Garcia published this paper a year ago in March. They looked at some of the CO2 that comes out of the diesel, but most of all they looked at the methane. This is announcements of their study. These graphs are part of their study. The purple part of the graph is the impact of the methane. And shale gas comes up here. Coal is way down here. Conventional gas, not as bad because there's less leak. And one of the problems is you don't know when you're going to get the methane, and so you flare it a lot. In North Dakota, where they're now fracking for oil, the gas is kind of a waste. It's selling so cheaply now that they won't even build a pipeline, so they just flare it off all the time. Not properly regulated. I don't mean to, I have a lot of friends with the DEC, I work with them. The problem is they're understaffed and they keep getting decimated. It's so bad that a year and a half ago, Pete Granis, who was pretty much promoting gas drilling as the former commissioner, when there was yet another cut in the DEC staff in November of 2010, I believe, he had the nerve to tell then Governor Patterson, we cannot regulate this industry with these cuts. He got fired for that. You have 17 people in the minerals section to regulate all of this. Well, we can skip over most of this. Compulsory integration, that means they're going to drill under your land whether you want them to or not. You'll get some percentage if there's a profit. There is no profit in the gas industry when the price of gas per million cubic foot is down below $5 or $6 a gallon. It's fluctuating now around $2 a gallon. In fact, Chesapeake announced in January that they were cutting back their drilling 50% because they can't make any money. If the companies don't make money, then all those royalties that we hear about, the royalties built into leases, there won't be any because of the definition of how it's calculated. And then we hear it's about energy independence. Well, Chesapeake, and I picked on Chesapeake because they're the major leaser over in Cortland and Onondaga County. I've reviewed between 500 and 600 leases in the last year and a half. They're predominantly the company doing it, but all the companies are doing the same thing. Chesapeake is so leveraged, so overborrowed that they keep selling their leases for profits. And they sell them to foreign companies. They sold all of their Fayette shale, that's down in Arkansas, to BHP Billiton, that's an Australian company, for $4.75 billion. They have sold 32.5% of all their New York leases to a Norwegian company, Statoil, again for billions. The CEO of Chesapeake, Aubrey McClendon, told the Rolling Stone magazine very clearly, we don't make money drilling, we make money flipping leases, selling them for 5 to 10 times what we paid for them. They just sold a major chunk of Texas leases for $11,000 an acre to a Chinese company. They don't pay $11,000. And so those companies are buying into it to get the gas exported there. Chesapeake is the first company to apply for export. They're going to export this gas because they can sell it for 5 to 10 times as much in Europe and Asia. And it's a pattern that Chesapeake brags about to their investors. So it isn't about keeping the gas here, making us independent of the Middle East the way they want to tell us. It's about corporate profit. These are just some recent examples of problems. And this is just this year. EPA finds arsenic, barium, magnesium in dimming households. Methane, there's all sorts of stuff in that water in dimming. The DEC fined the Buffalo Area Company for polluting a trout stream in the Allegheny Park down in the southwestern part of the state. That's from a vertical well. In February, they test find the gas drilling chemicals in the West Virginia well. Toluene, T-butyl alcohol, chloromethane. February, part of the problem that we have out west is the huge ozone problem that's created by this. In the Wyoming frac fields, where people are scarcer than animals, the ozone levels in the winter are higher than in downtown LA from the fracking industry. An article in January saying that the gas drilling is destroying the Pennsylvania state forest. Here's just one family in Granville, Pennsylvania. Now, I'm not saying this happens in every way, but the industry tells us it never happens. So what I try to do is at least get people to understand what some of you have already said. This is a heavy industrial operation. You don't have enough regulators. There's almost no federal regulation because of the 2005 Energy Act, what's called the Halliburton loophole, where almost all provisions of most federal environmental statutes the industry is exempt from. And so we have to look at our state that's overstaffed, understaffed, overworked, and there are problems. And there are a lot of problems in Pennsylvania, there are a lot of problems in Colorado. I've been to meetings with victims from about 8 different states, just had the EPA documenting problems in Wyoming. So here's a dairy farmer in Pennsylvania. And she woke up one morning at 6 o'clock to find 18 trucks in her driveway. And the hillside behind her house was level for a drill pad, 500 feet from her back door. New York, the setback is only 200 feet from the home. And once the fracking began, the water trucks made hundreds of trips. DEC estimates at least 1,000 truck trips per well. Air compressors roared all day, 24/7. Gas was flared off, visible 12 miles away. Her backpack sure became a full-time industrial zone. Then she began to notice that the water in the trough out back stopped freezing. Her kitchen faucets began to sputter and spit. Her husband seemed to have a lot of headaches. She felt nauseous if she stayed in the shower for more than a few minutes. I discovered I just light my water on fire. Tests showed that she had methane, radium. Another thing we don't hear much about is that the Marcellus Shale has naturally occurring radioactive material. It's part of how the formation 350 million years ago. So that when this frac fluid comes back up, it not only has all the chemicals they put in it, and they'll say, well, that's less than 1%. When you're dealing with 8 million gallons, that means you have about over 500,000 pounds of chemical per frac. Half of that water stays in the ground. Destroyed forever. Taken out of the water cycle forever. Now, one of the answers to the problem of the polluted water that comes out of the well is, well, we'll put it in deep injection wells, further destroying water, causing earthquakes in Ohio. So you have a lot of environmental issues from this heavy industrial operation. She has methane, radium, magnesium, strontium. Now it's virtually impossible to sell her house, but she does get a royalty check of $70. As I said, I do a lot of lease consulting. I've looked at a lot of leases. Every lease I've looked at calls for the storage of gas underneath the property. Not just drilling, storage. Very few people understood that when they signed. Storing as much as they want to. You can build a compressor under most leases. So that's a quick overview of some of the problems. I could also talk about an hour on each one of these things. This is what we need to think about, really, for our children and our grandchildren. And that is, first of all, we could use about half the energy we already do. This is a small vertical axis wind turbine, 8 feet in diameter. It just happens to be that that's the old Hotel Syracuse in the background, closed down because of the economy. And there's an industry incubator on this side of Warren Street. This is a small vertical access wind turbine, 8 feet high, 8 feet around, and they're being installed around central New York. We know, whoops. Well, I'll use my toys, you know. Subsidies, we could talk about that later. Windmills, we need to really think about renewable energy. The problem is that because we give over $4 billion a year to the oil industry for subsidies, mainly for exploration and drilling, we don't have subsidies for homes. In many cities in the Southwest and in Florida, they have mortgage programs so that homeowners can afford to put these kind of solar arrays in their house and pay them off over time. We need to decentralize. Germany is a leader in solar power. They don't get any more sun than we do. We have to start thinking about this. The problem is most of it is too expensive. This is my basement. Now, most of my house is cluttered because I am not the cleanest person. This is a geothermal heating system. Drill down into get enough water to get a mass, and you use a heat exchanger, kind of a reverse refrigeration process. The red pipes here are, they lead up to below the floor. Radiant heating is also, this is taken just before they install the hot air back up to that, but it doesn't burn any fossil fuel to heat the home and cool the home. That's the kind of thing we have to start thinking about. I happen to live on a small lake, so I like this. And that's the way you can get a hold of me. So what I'm really trying to say is that it's not clean, it's not safe, it's not green, and it's not properly regulated. And so what a lot of people are doing is, because of the lack of the federal regulation, because of the unknowns at the state, you clearly have a governor now that thinks this is going to have to come in, and they're looking to their towns for protection. And we hear about tax revenue coming in. That's, first of all, we should have an exit tax like every other state. But there's a lot of burden on local government that comes with fracking. First of all, you've got a fire protection problem. Here you have petroleum extraction out in the country, many times on newly constructed roads. You have hundreds of chemicals that you don't know what they are. And when you start talking to volunteer fire departments about that, they know very well this is a very risky situation. So we have increased burdens on local government. You certainly have health departments that are going to have to take complaints. The roads, you start putting that many roads, trucks on rural roads, it tears them up. And so towns have to think ahead to do that, and they have to figure out how they're going to pay for that damage. There are homeless people in Pennsylvania now, in rural Pennsylvania, because they bring in roustabouts. It's good that we have people working to try to get local people hired into this, because that's not what's going on in Pennsylvania. You have man camps where people come in from Oklahoma and Texas, causing all sorts of law enforcement problems, and driving the rents up to the point where people can't. We have to face all of these problems, and it's a boom or bust. Boom and bust, because even if it goes well for the 5 to 15 years that the well will produce, and actually the industry's telling us that these wells produce a lot longer than they are, they're playing out a lot quicker than they are, but they have to tell that to their investors so they can borrow more. So there's a lot of burdens on local governments too. Trying to see what else was. When we talk about trusting the DEC, I think the people in DEC, we've met with them, my clients and other Indian nations have met with the DEC repeatedly, with both Commissioner Granis and now Commissioner Mark Tennant. The problem is they're understaffed. We just had the state government reject spending money for a human health impact study on fracking. We have the EPA performing a study to see the impact of this industry on water. We should wait for that. But why don't we have a study done by the state government that talks about these human health problems that some of you already raised? How can we be confident going ahead when we won't even raise that study? So that's what I would say to start off with. And if I have to explain, I'm very hard of hearing. I have what I think are the best hearing aids I can, so if you speak up when you ask questions, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Joe, regarding the DEC and its ability to regulate, we have a well in my town. I'm in the town of Guilford, that is right nearby here, and it's called the Hanahan Well. I got interested in it because it was the first well that was permitted in my town. So I looked up the file on it. And it is being drilled, or it is, the wellhead is in an archaeologically sensitive area, which required them to get a release from the Parks Department, the New York State Parks. And I spoke to this woman up in Avon. She's a wonderful person. Kohler, was that her name? Yeah, and she was very nice. She said, would you like me to send you a copy of the letter that the park sent to DEC saying that there was no archaeological impact? I said, that would be a delight, and I'll put it in my file. Well, my eyes almost fell out of my head because the letter from Parks places this well in a different county. It places it in Delaware County. And then when I scrutinized the other several documents, one of them was the spacing map. The well is actually in the town of Guilford, in Shenango County, on State Highway 8. Now, the other documents give even a third address. they place it on Highway 12, which is, it's not a short distance, it's 15 to 20 miles away from where the well really is. And I'm wondering, do you see much of this discrepancy in permit applications? There's another well I've heard, and I've not seen the documents, in Cherry Valley in Otsego County, where I'm told that if you go by the geodesic marks, that it would be in the center of Lake Erie. So all of this indicates, and I've spoken with people from DEC, and I know they're very fine people, and they're trying their best to do their job. But at some point, when you get them, and you're near your pension, and you don't want to get fired before your pension, and I'm not saying that's what motivates them, but certainly would be a fear in my mind when they're decimating state agencies. When they're told to speed things up, I know what will happen. I worked in government also for many years. You do what you're told sometimes, even though you have to bite your tongue as you're doing it. So have you seen many of these discrepancies in the paperwork in BBC?
Well, that question brings up a couple of problems. I'm familiar with that well because we've got some complaints about it, and where it is actually a highly sensitive archaeological area. It's right next to the river. The Parks Department, SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, has maps that indicate archaeological sensitivity. This is a very sensitive area, and it just fell through the cracks between the agencies. There's no other way. And when you try to, we have asked DEC to set up a meeting where they will sit down with SHPO, and this is a major concern to the Indian nations because they're very concerned about sacred sites and unmarked burial sites that are very near the river. The problem with using the S-cuts, and you've heard that term quite a bit here, supplemental generic environmental impact statement. The key word there is generic. The theory is that every well is the same, regardless of its location, regardless of its archaeological sensitivity, regardless of how many other wells are around, because there's no cumulative impact. But every well is the same under this theory, and so you can use really a shortened, a less restrictive environmental review. If we would make each well submit a full environmental site-specific impact statement, we would go one step closer to, first of all, that would require an archaeological review. It would require public notice so that if somebody's drilling a well down the block from you, down the street, over the hill, you would know about it. You would get a chance to have a public hearing. There's no public hearings for these. There's no notice for these. There's no notice even to towns for these. So that's part of the problem. The other problem is agencies don't play well together. They don't talk to each other. We have good contacts at DEC to blame SHPO. We have good contacts in SHPO to blame DEC for that failure. And the other problem that we have at DEC is the structure of the environmental conservation law. They have a three-way conflict. Our law requires them to promote the development of this resource, then turn around and regulate it, and they're also leasing state forests for profit. It's just, and it's not anybody's individual fault, that's the structure of the state law, three-way conflict. And the other problem that we have is that pipelines are not regulated by DEC. Some of them are regulated by the Public Service Commission. Some of them are regulated federally depending on the size and the pressure. And so every time, and I've seen this in multiple environmental situations, if you have more than one agency, you really need to worry about the coordination between them, and that well is one of the problems. And I think the answer is don't use a generic process. Each well is different. Each community is entitled to a public hearing to decide whether or not you can ask questions. You probably know more about this area than somebody in the minerals division in Albany. So I think that you've raised a very valid concern there. It clearly was a failure in that well. They know it. They still haven't come up with a way to not let it happen again. They're still pointing fingers at each other. That's fault.
if I could just add, the reason Parks got the wrong address is because the address was provided by the drilling company. So they told them the address and it was in the other county, and that's why they told me it slipped through their cracks. The address that they were given was not in the archaeological sensitive area, and nobody vets the information. That's the problem.
Anybody else have some questions of this gentleman?
I went to a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I listened to a gentleman from Salt Springs, Pennsylvania. He's a leaseholder. He's a landowner. Mr. Clark, I believe his name was. And they had issues down there with some families, not all, but some homeowners where the water went bad. His water went bad too, and he's dealing with it. 6th generation landowner, he says he is. But he said the environmental, the economic impact that he saw within the Springville Dimmick areas was that the price of a lot of things went up. The price of bales of hay, bales of hay was very hard to find, and if you did find hay, because the industry buys up all the hay, you have to pay 3 times as much. Truck drivers were very hard to find because a lot of them were taking jobs with the industry. Lines and lines of trucks alongside the roads, school buses being held up. I would expect that probably the price of rent tripled. People were pushed out of their rentals, given 30 days to move out. They were paying $900 to $1,000 a month, $1,200 a month. Now the rent went up to $2,500. They couldn't afford it, so they had to leave because the people working in the industry wanted that rental. So what I'm saying is that an exaggerated examples of what's happening, or is that really happening in Pennsylvania and other parts of the country?
Well, certainly not an isolated incident in Pennsylvania. I've heard dozens of incidents in each of those families. As I said before, you have a lot of workers coming in from out of the area. I don't know, certainly the industry doesn't seem, they're non-union. We just had an article in the New York Times this week about how deadly this industry is for workers. A lot of it on the road, because they work incredible hours, and they're exempted from the same regulations that apply to other programs. So it's a very dangerous industry. It's non-union, and they grab housing. And the housing is so short that there are service industries that rent man camps, essentially trailer camps, to house workers. And so all of that puts a large burden on small. Where would you put 500 frac workers in this community? You know, if there are rental properties, they would go, they have gone. There are counties in Pennsylvania dealing with homeless problems that were not there before the frac. So it's, you know, clearly there are some businesses that benefit. The diners, the motels, you can't get a motel room in many parts of Pennsylvania. The cost of those is way out of reach compared to what it was. And so you have to make choices here. If that's what you want in your community, you're not going to have tourism. And people in the Finger Lakes are waking up to this. How are we going to have a wine industry, a fishing-based industry, a tourism industry, if we have gas storage in Washington Land and fracking around the Finger Lakes? There's some areas that this just isn't going to work. And so I've heard of those kinds of problems repeatedly in Pennsylvania. I've visited areas in Pennsylvania where people have this. And so it's not, so some people are making good money off in this, but a lot of people who are not associated with the industry are suffering.
If people have already signed the lease, how, is there a way to get out of it, or are they in it as long as they pay?
Well, every lease has, I always say I want to look at the lease in order to properly answer that. But if it has, every lease that I've seen has a primary term, usually 5 years, during that 5 years, you've made an agreement. You're bound by that agreement. The problem, as we were discussing before the program, is that when the companies, particularly Chesapeake, but every other company, Fortuna, Norris, they have an automatic extension clause in the lease, so that you have one paragraph that says this is a 5-year lease that runs from May of 2006 to May of 2011, and they give you the date that it supposedly ends. The next paragraph says automatic extension. The company can extend the lease at its option merely by tendering payment equal to the amount to start. So instead of a 5-year lease that it says, it's really a 10-year. So there's that problem. Chesapeake is claiming to extend all of their leases, and they're not the only ones. Fortuna did it. I just use Chesapeake because they're a good target. And they got a CEO that just says amazing things. They have claimed that they can extend every one of their leases because of a concept called force majeure, which is it's a contract clause. It really means, it's a French term that means major force. Really what it's supposed to mean is if I'm contracted to build your house and I can't get lumber because of a strike in Canada, I'm relieved of my obligation to build the house while that force that I can't control is going on. They're claiming that because of the state regulatory pause, they have a right to extend every lease. And once a company says we're extending your lease, you have very few options. Homeowners have banded together in Pennsylvania and filed 2 lawsuits. One of them they lost because every lease has an arbitration clause in it. Now these are very complex documents, long, small print. I have been quoted before, and I stand by it, 99% of the lawyers in the state can't read them and advise people on them. We're doing some continuing legal education next month, maybe helping with that, but because of the arbitration clause, you can't even get to court. So you have to go through arbitration first. The costs split between the homeowner and the company. So if the company's lawyers do what company lawyers do, which is extend and complicate and drive the price up, you pay for half of that before you can even get into court. And the other lawsuits survived that arbitration problem, and we hope to get a ruling on that because all leases in New York are now in question as to whether or not they're extended or not. And once you have a lease filed with the county clerk's office, you have a cloud on your title. You have a problem with insurance, you have a problem getting a mortgage. If you want to sell it, there are some banks that will not write mortgages when you have gas leases on them. Because of the setbacks are not as great as the setbacks requirement by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that finance most of the secondary mortgage market. 90% of the mortgages are sold on the secondary mortgage market. So these are clouds on title, and no, you can't just end them because you've learned. Now, because you've learned that it's not what you thought you were getting.
Even if you sell it and you don't own it anymore, it still goes with the property?
The lease goes with the property, and the new owner is bound by the lease. And if they don't tell the company that they've got a new deed, which is another clause hidden over there on page 3, the company sends the extension checks to the first owner. I've seen a very bad example of that in a divorce situation in Portland County where the husband took the check and the wife got stuck with the extension. The leases are very bad for homeowners. The company lawyers have figured out by writing hundreds of thousands of leases around the company what works for them. You can see the evolution of the clauses, and a lot of homeowners are now figuring out we weren't dealt with fairly to begin with, and now we're not being dealt with fairly again. And we hope we can get the Attorney General to step in. I think there was massive fraud in getting these leases. Certainly people weren't told. A lease is a contract that should be a meeting of the mind so that you should be informed what it is you're giving away, what is in that lease. I think in that 500 to 600, I don't think anybody understood exactly everything they were giving away. It's very complex. We really think that, and the state law, in order to terminate a lease after that primary term, if you don't have one of those extensions, is and very burdensome for the landowner. We've developed letters to help people with that. I do a lot of speaking about lease termination. And what I find is that there are thousands of landowners in New York who signed leases before we knew what this industry was, and they can't get out of their leases.
Now, this fellow has a question right here.
I've got a question. A lot of the pictures in your slideshow with the open pits, were they taken in New York State?
They're taken in Pennsylvania. There's very limited horizontal fracking in New York State.
Oh, New York State doesn't allow open pits now. They're going to be using a closed loop system. I don't know if you let everybody know that.
That's what the S guys said.
Okay, that's what I'm counting on. Also, there's no injection wells like in Ohio to cause earthquakes. There will be no state land drilling on the surface in these state forests.
These are all wish lists.
No, I think these are going to be in the final S-guys.
You know that.
Well,
Yeah, they'll be there.
If it's so safe, why
And
don't
those
you
aren't
just say no?
regulations. What are they going to do with the frac fluid?
They're going to send it to treatment plants that can handle frac fluid.
Say again?
They will. They'll be there.
Say again?
They'll be sending it to treatment plants.
They have treatment plants that can handle that stuff.
There are no treatment plants in New York.
You can't treat
They will
radioactivity.
set them up.
You can't treat this in a sewage
One at a
plant.
time, one at a time.
You can't treat this stuff in a sewage plant. The salt is 5-6 times saltier than seawater. It's radioactive. It has chemicals. None of those are removed by a standard treatment plant. In fact, it inhibits the treatment of the bacteria in a sewage plant. Our 10 says we won't let it go to treatment plant. But there's no place for it to go, is the point. And there's millions of gallons of it.
This fellow back here had a question.
Yeah, if we go back to, you were talking about the pitfalls of a company lease and to avoid compulsory integration, wouldn't it be a good idea to join a landowners coalition and collectively, be a part of a lease agreement that benefits the landowner?
Certainly there are leases that could be much better than the standard company lease. I've seen a landowner coalition lease that's 28 pages. And there are many, many things you could put in a lease that's not in the Chesapeake lease that's brought to the door by landowners. It's not going to protect you from air pollution. It's not going to protect you from a lot of these other things. You can certainly have much more of a control over how the process is done and the placement of wells. And you can get better leases. Whether or not that's going to protect people in the long run or not, I'm not convinced of that. That's up to people to decide. But certainly the standard lease offers almost no protection.
I have a question about salt mines. Was there any discussion about using abandoned salt mines for holding fracking produced fluids from drilling in New York? Have they thought about using them?
No.
Abandoned salt mines are targeted for storage of gas. That's the Watkins Glen plant. I don't know whether or not, I haven't seen a plan that I'm aware of that would store frac fluid. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened. The problem is, what we're told is, well, all this happens underground. If we put it underground, it'll go away. Life is not that simple. What happens when you get an earthquake with all those faults? Is it going to migrate? We ought to be, this is a very risky industry. Certainly, what they're targeting, methane and other gases, are very explosive. We should be using a precautionary principle. Do it as safely as we can. And that's not the way it's going down. At least in Pennsylvania, it's not what happened in Colorado. It's not what happened in Texas.